Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. My name is Trevor. I'm here with Glenn, my dad, today, and we are going to talk about.
Actually, I'm his dad every day.
Well, that is true. Start over. Today, we're going to talk about what does it mean to follow Jesus. We've been having these conversations about who he is, but the meaning of Christianity is more than just recognizing the truth about who Jesus is, but it is the commitment to give loyalty to him, to follow him. That's what it means to be a Christian. So, how do you do it? What does it mean to follow Jesus? That is about as big a topic as we could probably decide to jump into. Essentially, the whole podcast is this topic, isn't it? So, all the conversations we've had up to now, all the conversations we're going to have in the future are really about how do we follow Jesus, and is us actually in the process of doing it. So,
and I think that when you say big, it's not just a broad topic, but it is the biggest topic.
yeah,
It is the most important thing of being a Christian,
yeah.
is figuring out how to follow Jesus.
So, I guess, what do we want to accomplish today then in our conversation? Since it's such a big topic, I don't think our goal is going to be to try to give a comprehensive overview of it, but rather to maybe pick out a couple of things that are good starting places for people, maybe try to answer some burning questions that people might have, but also maybe to just kind of kickstart a series of episodes here, where we go through it a little more. So what I have prepared here is a conversation about faith. Do you want to start with that, or do you want to start with anything else?
No, I think that's a great place to start. So,
Cool.
yeah, and maybe defining what faith is helpful. I
Yep.
mean, we all have an understanding of what faith is, and
Yep.
maybe from person to person that slightly changes. But when the Bible talks about it, what does it actually mean? I think is where we need to start with.
That sounds good. I think what got me to this starting point was thinking about what do most Christians want to know about following Jesus? What's the first sort of question on their mind? And I think one of the very first things they're wondering is, what relationship do I need to have with Jesus so that I will be saved? He brings salvation. But if I just learn the facts about who he is and I agree with that truth, am I saved? And I think probably what we're going to say about faith is more than just knowledge or just agreement with that knowledge. And so I think defining what that is, what is this new thing I'm trying to grasp as a new Christian, is sort of where we're starting.
There are times when the Bible talks about faith, and it's not necessarily talking about belief. So it's not very often, but there are occasionally, especially in the New Testament, a few places where it talks about faith, and what it means is the faith, which is a collection of beliefs.
Yeah.
And in that instance, it probably is closer to a set of beliefs that you just have to grasp and get a hold of.
Yeah.
But there aren't very many of those instances.
Sure.
Most of the time in the New Testament, especially when the word faith is used, it is something much deeper than just a collection of beliefs.
Yes, that's a good distinction because we still use the word faith like that today too. We talk about the Christian faith.
Right,
We're here on
exactly.
this podcast to talk about our faith, and when we say that, we don't necessarily mean my personal relationship with Jesus in the way that we're going to talk about. We mean the set of truths that we hold to. Yeah,
exactly.
that's right. But what we're going to talk to when we jump in here is less that and more that personal relationship with Jesus thing.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to read here a couple of notes that I made. So if you guys are watching on camera and you're wondering why I'm looking this way, this is where my notes are over here. The Bible is clear that we can be a part of the people/family of God through faith in Jesus. And this is important because for the people that Paul, for example, is talking to when he writes a letter, their understanding of how to be a part of the family of God from before the time of Jesus in the Old Testament involved, at least in some way, the law,
Mm-hmm.
circumcision, being Jewish, all of these ideas. And Paul is saying, in Jesus, it's not the law that saves us. It's not doing the good work that God has asked us to do. It's having faith in Jesus Christ. That's what makes us a part of God's family.
Absolutely.
So then we need to talk about what it is.
Probably, if you've gone to church very much at all, you've heard the Hebrews chapter 11, where it says, "Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen," and that's the simplest definition of faith.
Yeah.
It is believing in something that you can't actually hold in your hands. So it's and then it goes on and talking about the fact that we live by faith, not by sight.
Yeah.
And that is again contrasting things that are visible, physical, that you actually touch, versus things that are of a spiritual nature.
Yeah.
And biblical faith is trusting in those things of a spiritual nature even more than things that are of a physical nature.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when you start talking about faith being the substance of things hoped for and the assurance of things not seen, I think where a lot of people, where their minds go, is faith is how I believe in something that I can't prove. And I think this has led to an understanding of faith that means, like it's a blind leap of faith, right? Like that phrase. Like, there's just no way to know. Could be right, could be wrong. I'm going to have faith because I need it. I need to believe it. I'm not sure that's a very biblical understanding of faith.
Right, I would agree. And I think this definition from Hebrews 11:1 is the proof of that. Because it is not, it's not saying that there's absolutely no way that you could ever know. You just have to come up with something and believe in it. It's not saying that. It's the assurance of things that are hoped for, and there's a conviction of things not seen. So it's based on something tangible, something genuine, something real. It's just that you can't actually see it.
Right.
It's
Okay.
not
Yeah.
actually physical in its nature, but that doesn't mean it's not real.
Yeah. Hebrews 11 is going to go on to talk about a bunch of people who had amazing faith. What these people had was not just a hope or just like, I don't know if this is true, but I'm just going to have faith that it is. They were convinced that this was true.
Right.
That God was who he said he was and that he was going to bring salvation to them.
Yeah.
And I think that they were convinced based on evidence. They had seen things and heard God and seen him do amazing things.
Yeah.
And they had faith as a result.
That's right.
Yeah.
And you know, we all live our lives that way. We act and base everyday activities on things that we cannot see. But we have the experience to know that things like gravity are actually there.
Yeah.
And so we base our life on it.
Yeah.
And I think that that's also an ingredient in faith. Faith is a growing faith. It's an expanding faith. The faith of a child is less based on experience, but more based on trusting the person who is telling them something. Whereas as we get older, we have experienced these things, and so we then our faith is even more secure and grounded on those things. So as you grow as a Christian, your faith in God should increase. Because you have experienced his faithfulness, you've experienced his grace, you've experienced his mercy over an extended time.
Yeah.
So now, as he asks more and more of you, by faith, you can trust him even more as well.
And I think that as you talk about that, we're starting to get into what faith is that is more than belief. Because faith is being convinced of truth, and it is based on evidence and experience that truth is true. But it's more than just being convinced that the true thing is true. It's living your life by it. So, like an example of sort of, I guess, evidence for me personally. of God's presence in my life. Shortly after we moved here to England, Amelia and I were trying to get the girls into school. This was a really big deal to us because it was their first time not being homeschooled, and they're in a whole new country. We really wanted them to start school really close to the beginning of the year so that everybody else wouldn't already have their friends in their groups, and other kids would still be learning how things worked and things like that, so they wouldn't be as left out. So we were doing that. We were also looking for a house. We were looking at your guys' place, and we had gone to all the schools in the area and contacted them about getting the girls a place, and they all said that they were full. And there was one that hadn't got back to us. There was one that put us on a waiting list, things like this. And it was really discouraging because we could not figure out what we were supposed to do to get the girls in school. We heard that the council could help, but that was going to take like 6 weeks and all this stuff. And we wanted to, try to find a house to rent that was kind of close to the school. And it's like, if we don't know what school it is, how are we going to do that? So we, Amelia and I were in our room, and she was feeling really discouraged. And I was trying to console her, but I was feeling discouraged too. And I said, maybe we'll hear back from Sharp's cops yet. They haven't gotten back to us yet. And literally in the middle of me saying that sentence, Amelia got a phone call from Sharp's cops saying they had a place for both the girls. And then shortly after that, we started an application on this house that went through in one day. The guy called me the next day. He said, that was the fastest referencing ever carried out. You guys can come and pick up your keys. And this house is a 2-minute walk from Sharp's Cop School. God put all that together. And we tried our best, but God put the pieces together for us. And it was so clear that it was God doing it. And so for me, I look back on that, and I think that helps me hold on to, increase my faith, because it's evidence for me that God is faithful.
Right.
And it doesn't change my belief in Jesus. I had faith before that happened. But faith is something that it's more than just believing it. It's walking it, it's living it. And the next time I'm in a situation where I just can't figure out how to put the pieces of life together, I can look back on what God has done, and it helps me trust.
Right.
And so I think our faith is based on God's faithfulness. His faithfulness is the evidence that lets us have faith.
Right. All of those things that happened were not the result of your faith. In other words, because you said, maybe we'll hear a call, that's why it happened.
Right.
It wasn't based on the fact that you weren't struggling because you were. It wasn't. It had nothing to do with your faith itself.
Right.
It was all about God.
Yes.
And that's what your faith has to be in.
Yeah.
Because too many times we hear things like, well, if you just had more faith,
yeah,
then more things would happen. And that's not the case.
Right.
In fact,
God does want you to have more faith.
Sure.
But his blessing and his faithfulness is not dependent on our faith.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So for understanding faith, then, it's more than just believing something's true. It's living your life by that thing. A good example that preachers like to use in a sermon is like a chair. I can say the chair is strong enough to hold up a person. I can say I believe the chair is strong enough to hold up me. But it's not faith until I sit in the chair.
Right.
And I actually live my life. I actually take action, make decisions based on that faith. That's what makes it faith.
Yeah.
And I think some good English words to help us get our head around that are words like allegiance or loyalty. You can claim loyalty or allegiance to something or something, but it's not true unless you actually live like it's true.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And the chair example is a good example, but sometimes people might be hearing that and still saying, yeah, but the chair is actually physically there. So that's why I can trust it.
Yeah. Yep.
And what we're saying is actually the faith has nothing to do with the chair itself. The faith is your action.
Mm,
Do you trust the chair? And the chair is sort of like God, if you will.
Yeah.
And he is real, he is genuine. It's like in his invisible chair.
Right.
And now, will you sit on that chair,
Yeah, right.
even though you can't see it?
Yeah.
And that's when faith becomes even more difficult.
Yeah, that's right. Some people think I have faith in God or in Jesus, in Christianity, and I don't need to go to church, right? It's a personal thing. I can just worship at home. I can use a podcast. We talked about how this is good because a lot of people like to engage with content from their own homes as our society becomes more insular and things like that. And some people are living out Christianity that way. Faith in an invisible chair would be impossible if you'd never seen anybody sit on an invisible chair before.
Right.
But if you, every week or more often than that, you're interacting with other people, you're going to a place where everybody's sitting on invisible chairs, you're much more likely,
Yes.
to
that's
actually
exactly
be able
right.
to do that. Yeah.
Yep, definitely. Yeah. I like that.
So last time, Michael and I had coffee from Mexico,
Oh, right.
which I thought was really interesting tasting.
Yeah.
This is also coffee from Mexico,
Okay.
but it's not the same place in Mexico.
Okay.
And this is, it's natural processed.
So you were saying that they don't remove the bean
from the
casing?
fruit, yeah. From they
Okay.
call it the cherry.
Okay.
They just let it dry out inside it,
Right.
and so you end up with more interesting flavors that some people really don't like.
Yeah, there's definitely something deeper in there. It's you almost get it afterwards.
Right. So I went to an antique store and I bought this cool pewter mug
Yeah.
to drink coffee on the podcast in.
Right.
And I've discovered why they don't use pewter for mugs anymore, which is it's really hot.
Oh,
As
right.
soon as you put any hot liquid in it, the whole
Yeah.
mug, like I can't touch it where the liquid is
Right.
down. So
Does the handle get hot?
it does. Yeah.
Oh, does it?
I
All
can't
right.
use it for tea because tea's hotter than coffee.
You'll have to maybe get some leather and wrap it around.
That's a good idea.
It'll look cool
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
Once you've tasted that little aftertaste or that deeper taste, it almost overpowers it.
I described the other Mexican coffee as a 6 out of 10 for me.
Oh, okay.
Because it was kind of odd, kind of funky and strange. This, I'm guessing, is going to be more so.
Yeah.
But I had actually had a couple cups of that other one
Oh, right.
before I did the podcast. With
So you
Michael.
become immune to it.
Well, I was able to articulate my thoughts about it right at the beginning. I'm going to drink this throughout the podcast.
Okay.
And then maybe towards the end,
So
I'll try to rank
your
it.
ranking out of 10, is that just enjoyment of it?
Yeah, so I
Okay.
would say 5 would be, I'm totally neutral on this.
Okay.
It's good coffee. I enjoy it.
Right.
And this is a ranking for specialty coffee.
Okay.
So like if I were to put like a McDonald's coffee
Yeah. Yeah.
on my ranking, it would probably be like a 2 or
Okay.
a 3.
Sure.
And I actually like McDonald's coffee.
Yeah,
I just have
yeah.
a different scale for that.
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, a 6 is good.
Okay.
Is what I gave the other one. This one,
I think this would be a
Remains to
coffee
be
that I
seen.
could drink occasionally. I couldn't drink a lot of it.
yeah.
It tastes good. It's very good. It's very complex and a little surprising at times. Read an article the other day that Starbucks actually has almost a quarter of the caffeine in their lattes as Costa does.
I think I saw that headline.
Yeah,
I didn't read
yeah.
the article though.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
it's-
they really do.
yeah, it's a lot less. And the one that
Really?
had the most was, you might think Nero, but it wasn't. It was, what's the French one?
Oh,
Pret a manger.
oh, really?
Yeah,
Pret a
yeah.
Manger
Pret
has.
a manger has the most caffeine in their coffee.
Huh. All right. Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It would be. I don't know how we could do it exactly, but it'd be fun to do some side by side tests
Yeah.
sometime.
Yeah.
Maybe a special podcast episode.
We'd have to do a
where
lot
we
of pausing and run to the toilet.
Yeah. Okay. So I think one of the fundamental claims of the New Testament, especially as Paul is writing his letters, is that faith in Jesus is not works of the law.
Right.
So Ephesians 2, 8, and 9 is sort of a common place to go and to point this out. So if you're wondering what faith is, we've talked a lot about how faith is more than just believing something, it's living your life. So does that mean then that faith is synonymous with good works?
Right. Right.
If you read Ephesians 2, 8, and 9, you'll find it's not. What Paul says is, for by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not the result of works, so that no one may boast.
This is where faith and works start to become not confusing, but confused. Because the result of a life lived in faith is good works.
Yep.
And so, but you can also do good works without having faith as the motivating factor.
Yeah.
So you look at a person's life and compare them with another person, and as you look at those two lives, they look very similar. But one person may have faith as their motivating factor. The reason I do these things is because I am in a relationship with Jesus. I trust him, and I know he's asked me to do these things.
Yeah.
And so that's why I do them. Where the other person does exactly the same things, but his motivation is not, I do this because I'm in a relationship with Jesus and I trust him and he's asked me to do them, but I want to please this person so that he will do things for me.
Right.
So the result is the same, but the motivation is what's different.
Yeah, very much so. Absolutely. I think one thing, and this might be interesting because we might disagree about this. When it comes to soteriology, so that's the study of salvation, all the different mechanics and components of salvation, we try to put the puzzle pieces together. That's sort of the realm we're in right now. It's not our works that save us, it's our faith. Well, it's actually God's grace, but through faith. And as a result of being saved by grace through faith, we do good work. So this is our soteriology. Within soteriology, we have Calvinism, and that's a way of understanding how those things come about and how they relate to each other and stuff like that. And one of the things Calvinism says is the faith itself is a gift from God.
Right.
And I'm not inclined to disagree with that. But I do wonder sometimes if Calvinists tend to think of faith as a work. And that's why it needs to be a gift from God. Because if God is saving me because of my faith, it's like it's something that I do.
Right.
And now it's not all of God. It's partly of God and partly of me. That's called synergism rather than monergism. It's all of God.
Right.
And so to keep it from being partly me, that's my salvation, I have to say my faith comes from God.
Right.
And I wonder if that's really starting to think of faith as a work. And I think based on passages like Ephesians 2, we need to conclude that faith is not a work. That's Paul's whole point, is that it's faith, not works.
Right.
Do you think that Calvinism thinks of faith as a work?
I've never thought of it that way, but now that you say it, I think it may be an underlying, even subliminal way of trying to explain that. Because, like you say, if God rewards faith, which I think He does, then we automatically in our human mindset are looking at, I do something, so therefore this is the result. If God is rewarding, it's because I've done something. And if God rewards my faith, then I'm in charge of God's rewards. And that's not the way it is. And so we try then to take that faith and take it, like you say, out of our hands and put it into God's hands. The problem with that, though, is we then just become complete pawns without any ability or reason to be rewarded.
Or any responsibility for when we sin.
Exactly. We could just say, well, God didn't give me the faith to believe, so I had no choice but to do this or that.
And I think people who would not call themselves Calvinists, that's probably the biggest reason why they don't.
Sure,
Is
sure.
because they think Calvinism removes human responsibility,
Right.
makes God the source of evil.
Mm-hmm.
We are all just pawns and we have no free will of any kind.
Right. Right.
And there probably are Calvinists who kind of are guilty of thinking that way.
There are,
I don't
definitely.
think they think God is really the source of evil
Right,
in
right.
that he's responsible for evil kind of
Mhm.
sense. But
Mm-hmm.
they maybe do have an inconsistency in their
Right.
thinking. So
Yeah. And
you would consider yourself a Calvinist.
yeah, I would.
But
And-
you don't believe that God is a source of evil,
Right.
or that we have no free will and that we're just pawns and that we're not
Exactly, yeah.
responsible.
Yeah.
And so it's possible.
Yeah,
yeah,
mhm.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
for people
definitely.
considering it,
Yeah. And we're not, again, we're not saying Calvinism is an evil, wrong theology. What
Nope.
we're saying is sometimes it can lead to incorrect understandings of what genuine faith
Yep.
really is.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. I'm still on the fence about whether I would like to use the label Calvinist for myself. I definitely am Calvinistic in several ways.
Right.
For me, for me the hard part is Calvinism, and I'm going to say like your understanding of Calvinism, which I think consider to be balanced and appropriate, definitely seems to flow out of some passages of Scripture. But there's so much of what the Bible is saying that talks from a human perspective for us. It talks about our responsibility to respond to the gospel. Like it's a call to response. You know, which on some level seems to be hard to reconcile with the Calvinistic approach of saying, first of all, the atonement made by Jesus is only for those who are chosen, who are elect, and those who are not chosen, God's not going to give them faith. So there isn't really a need for a call to response. I'm not saying that it's irreconcilable because the Bible is a message for everyone, for the elect and the non-elect, and so it needs to give a call to response. So. But to me, I'm just wondering if looking at human beings and our relationship to God with more of an emphasis on our free will is more in concert with the Bible than Calvinism sometimes allows.
Right.
I'm not sure. Still working on it, but yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting, and again, I think the theology of salvation or soteriology goes way deeper than either Calvinism or Arminianism or whatever other isms we as people have tried to put together goes, and so it is much deeper because it is a thing, if you will, from God. And we cannot understand God's ways.
Right.
So for us to put together 5 little points and say this is how God operates,
Right.
you know, that's a pretty small box.
Yeah,
to
that's
put
true.
God into.
Absolutely. We're talking about the mechanics of God's mind and his plan for redemption. It's like there's no system of belief we can come up with that's going to fully explain
Yeah,
that. So you're absolutely right. This coffee's growing on me as I drink
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
I'm thinking it's going to be a 7
Oh, okay.
because to me it's kind of similar. It's kind of strange, like the other one, the other Mexican coffee. But I think, and maybe it's the natural processing. It's got a little bit of fruitiness that that one didn't have. And to me, the last time I had natural coffee, I thought this too, that it's kind of like it almost tastes like a strawberry milkshake. The way the fruitiness interacts with the coffee, I don't know, it just makes me think of a strawberry milkshake.
Yeah. Now that you say that, I'm seeing that. There's absolutely no bitterness whatsoever in it.
It's not very bitter at all.
Yeah.
That's true. Yep, that is true. That tends to be one of the biggest differences between what people call specialty coffee,
Okay.
which is normally freshly ground, freshly roasted, and often more lightly roasted.
Oh, okay.
Because like dark roasted coffee tends to be more bitter, and it tends to be like, at least for me, dark roasted coffee is something to put milk and sugar in to give it its sweetness and its flavor. It's
Sure.
just the bitter kind of foundation for
Yeah.
those other flavors. Whereas this has all that other stuff on top of
Right.
a little bit of bitterness. But yeah.
Well, I think what's nice about this is I tend to gravitate to dark
Mm-hmm.
roasted coffees
Mhm.
because it's got a lot of flavor.
Mm.
Whereas this has a lot of flavor without it being bitter or
Yeah, it
darkly
is.
roasted.
It's harder to get the flavor out of a light roasted coffee.
Mm-hmm.
You have to grind it finer. You have to put
Mhm.
hotter water in it and leave it in longer.
I see.
So if you buy a light roasted coffee and a dark roasted coffee and then you brew them the same,
Mm-hmm.
the light roasted coffee is going to taste sour because it's
Right.
under extracted
I see.
and weak.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yep.
Much like faithless Christians.
Because they're sour and weak.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're talking about faith and works, I think, in a way that is going to be able to let us approach certain passages of scripture and make sense of them
Mm-hmm.
when they would otherwise be very confusing.
Mm.
So I think maybe we should do that
Mm-hmm.
for those people who might come to these passages and find themselves confused.
Mm.
Paul clearly taught that salvation comes by faith and not works. But he does also say, to some extent, that we are going to be judged according to our works.
Mm-hmm.
And for us Protestant Christians, that is a strange thing to admit out loud that Paul says that.
Mm-hmm.
If you're coming to this podcast and your question is, am I saved because of my faith in Jesus, or am I saved because of my good works? The answer is you're saved because of your faith in Jesus. Don't let any of the rest of our discussion derail you on that point. But if you're coming to this podcast with the question of, what do I do with Romans chapter 2, verses 6 through 11? I think that's what the rest of this conversation is for.
Sure.
I just didn't want to confuse anybody with what we're about to
Absolutely.
talk about. So I've got Romans chapter 2, verses 6 through 11, if you guys are making a list. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 10. And Matthew chapter 16, verse 27. So we're going to have just a quick look at these. Romans 2 is the biggest one, the longest one.
Mm-hmm.
And when we read it, people listening might think, well, that directly contradicts everything they've just said.
Right.
And so we'll try to
Mhm.
explain
Mhm.
here. Romans 2, verses 6 to 11 says this. He will render to each one according to his works. To those who by patience and well-doing seek for glory and honor and immortality, he will give eternal life. But for those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, there will be wrath and fury. There will be tribulation and distress for every human being who does evil, the Jew first and also the Greek. But glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek, for God shows no partiality. 2 Corinthians 5:10 says, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. And Matthew 16:27 says, for the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. This is probably not a comprehensive list, but I think it's a good starting place for the fact that there are passages of the Bible that talk about the final judgment that we face being based on the things that we have done in life.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we reconcile that with the fact that we're saying
Mm-hmm.
what Paul is saying in Ephesians 2,
Mm-hmm.
that we're saved by grace through faith,
Right.
not by works.
Right. And the first thing I would say is that the Bible doesn't really recognize a faith that doesn't also produce works. So, in our culture, we can say, "Well, I believe one thing, but I act another way,"
Yeah.
and we want to be okay with that because we want to always look for the good in people. So we might look at a person who is constantly doing bad things and evil things, and we want to believe that deep down there is still good in them.
Yeah.
And so we want to separate what they think and who they are from how they act. We're desperate to do that.
Yeah.
And so when we come to the Bible, that's how we often will look at these passages.
Yeah.
That how can that there might possibly be a person who believes in Jesus, but he still doesn't necessarily act that way. We want to accept that. We want to believe that. But the fact is, the Bible doesn't recognize that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good thing to emphasize and let it sink in. The Bible doesn't recognize a faith that does not result in works.
Exactly.
So when we read Ephesians 2:8 and 9, you're saved by grace through faith and not of works. The tendency is for our mind to say, okay, so what that means is the test for if that's true, the way I mathematically parse that out is, if there's a person who has faith but not works, that person's still saved.
Right.
As if that's what Paul is trying to say.
Right.
But he's
Right.
not. He's not saying that.
Exactly.
He's saying you have faith and works. You need to know which one of those two things it is that saves you.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. Okay,
Yep.
good. Yeah.
So I think once you start with that, you realize that it's perfectly just for God to judge based on works, because those works will have been the result of faith.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, earlier we talked about the fact that there might be two individuals who their lives look the same, so they both have good works, but the motivation for them was different. So yes, God will judge on works. But actually, I think what we will discover if we go deeper into Scripture is he doesn't only judge on works. He will also judge on the motivation for those works.
Sure. Yeah. Good. Good. I've got a list of 5 statements, potential options for people to kind of organize these things are in their mind. And I think some of the stuff that we've been saying maybe falls under some of them.
Okay.
Some of them I would maybe say are not true, but some of them you could hold side by side. So let me list them here.
Okay.
Some options. Number 1, the judgment is only about the rewards. It's not about whether or not we get in. So if we're thinking about this judgment as at the end of our life or at the end of time, and the two futures in front of me are eternity with God or eternity without God, this option says what Paul is saying here in Romans, what Jesus is saying in Matthew, is not about if you get eternity with God. It's rather about the rewards you receive, as if there's some level. So for some people in their minds, they're thinking, okay, the crowns I receive in glory and that kind of a thing. What do you think about that option?
I think the passage in Romans is directly against that, because the reward there is eternal life.
Yep.
So I would say that that's not what this passage is talking about.
Yeah, I agree. This is one that I don't think is true. There is a passage, and I'm not sure where it is off the top of my head, where Jesus says, some will stand before me and claim that they've done works in my name, and he'll tell them, depart from me, I never knew you.
Right.
And when he says, depart from me, it's clearly not come in, you just get less.
Right.
It's clearly you don't get in.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And there's actually, again, I a lot of the things that I believe come from a Calvinistic point of view.
Yep.
But in that particular passage, Jesus says, depart from me, not because you never knew me.
Right.
Depart from me because I never knew you.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
again, you've got this individual doing these works, but their motivation is to try and persuade Jesus to do something for them,
That's right.
rather than just the pure love and admiration that you have for him.
Absolutely. So that passage is Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 21. It says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness.
What makes that passage difficult is the emphasis does seem to be on the actions themselves. It talks about the one who does the will of my Father. So that's works.
That's right.
But at the same time, the works that are done, and they are good works, casting out demons, prophesying, things like that, those are good works as well.
Mm,
So I think that what Jesus is again coming back to is at its heart faith,
yeah.
because they did things to try and make God do something for them.
Mm,
And so it wasn't based on what God actually wanted.
yeah.
It was based on what they wanted
Mm,
to do.
mm,
So it comes back to, do you trust Jesus and allow him to direct in your life the good works?
yeah.
Or do you just want to come up with your own good works
Yeah.
and try and make God do something as a result?
Right. Yeah. Good. Yeah. And we'll come back to this with one of our future options here because we've got more.
Mm.
But it seems that while the passage is focused on works, like you said, the point is, did he know you or not?
Exactly.
It's not did you do good enough works.
Mhm.
It's did he know you?
Right.
How do we know that? Based on the works.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, and the heart that's behind the works.
Right.
Because like you
Right.
said, Jesus says they actually did works.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't know them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So option 2 then. The judgment based on works is only a confirmation. And faith is the real basis of determining. So the idea then, like if you go back to Romans and Paul says there's this future point where we're all judged,
Mm-hmm.
and some receive eternal life and some don't based on what they did. The judgment is going to coincide with whether they had faith or not, even though it's about works. So you were always going to be saved by your faith, but then you get judged by your works, but it only ever confirms whether you had faith or not.
Right. Yeah.
I think there's some truth in this one. I'm not sure it's a full way of explaining it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's an idea.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna read some of the others here, and
Okay.
it'll maybe you'll see how that one is partly true.
Okay.
The judgment only applies to non-believers, and no one passes.
Right.
So the idea is everybody who's judged by their works fails,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but some of us won't be judged by our works.
Right. Right.
What do you think about that one?
I think that's a possibility. Yeah, I can see where that could potentially, because you made the statement to me earlier. Maybe you're gonna say it later on that we're all judged on works, but the only ones who pass are the ones who have applied the works of Jesus to our
Right.
life or something. to
Yeah.
that effect.
So we're all saved by works, just not our own.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
right.
Exactly. And that's where this statement would fall in.
Yeah. Yeah. So some people will, as they're articulating their eschatology, they'll say there's a judgment where Christians appear before Jesus. And then there's another judgment at the very end where the books are opened and those who their name is written in the book of life, they get in. And at that final judgment, everyone is judged based on their works, and that's what Paul's talking about. But John says in Revelation, that's the second death. But those who have been raised, the second death has no power over them.
Right.
So the idea is Christians don't actually appear in that judgment. Only non-Christians.
Right.
And nobody is saved. Everyone's judged on their works. Everyone fails.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
That's maybe an idea. For me, I don't think that's what Paul is talking about.
Okay.
Because he says we will all stand this judgment, Jews and Greeks. His whole point here in Romans is to try to get the Jews and the Greeks to stop thinking of themselves as two separate groups,
Right.
who will face different judgments based on different things.
Right.
He says it's all about Jesus now. So if that's his point, talking about a judgment that none of them are going to stand in, I don't think makes any sense.
Sure.
I don't think that's an answer to Romans. I'm not necessarily arguing against that construction of eschatology, but I don't think it answers our question fully here. Number 4, Christ's work is applied to us so we are judged by works, but not our own. That's the one
Right.
that you mentioned.
Yeah, yeah.
So we're all judged by works,
Mm-hmm.
but for a Christian, the works we're judged by is not my works, but Jesus' works.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, as you said, there's some truth to that.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you could bring that to Romans,
Mm-hmm.
especially since Paul's point is to unite Jews and Gentiles around the coming of the Messiah.
Right.
But I think that maybe that explanation does struggle a little bit with some of the other passages.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Where people claim to know Jesus, but he says, "I never knew you."
Right.
Or especially Second Corinthians for the works done in the body. Like it seems to be talking about your physical works you did on earth in your
Right.
lifetime.
Yeah.
Not
And I would
some-
say the Romans passage is also saying the same thing.
Mm,
So I
yeah.
don't think that, I think there are passages that back up that statement.
Yeah.
But I don't think this is one of them.
Right. Yep. I think Michael and I had a conversation about the atonement,
Mm-hmm.
and we talked about how in substitutionary atonement, Christ is substituted in our place for punishment,
Right.
so that we don't have to receive punishment for our sin. But that the substitution also includes us being placed in his place of righteousness.
Right. Right.
And so I think this idea does carry true in that biblical understanding of atonement.
Sure.
But it's not necessarily the idea present in these passages
Right.
that we've read.
Right.
So the final one that I have here, and this is going to make some people upset because it doesn't go a long way to explaining it,
Mm.
but I think it's very true and important. Paul saw no tension between being saved by faith and being judged by works.
Right. Right.
And I think that as we talk about it, the tension seems to build. It seems to be more and more that we can't be judged by works and saved by faith. For Paul, there was no contradiction
Right.
in those two terms.
Right.
And I think that's at least our starting place for understanding. So I have linked here 2 Corinthians 5, 6 through 10. It says, "So we are always of good courage. We know that while we were at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. For we walk by faith, not by sight. Yes, we are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and be home with the Lord. So whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil."
Right.
So it's that same passage we read earlier, but when you read the context,
Mm-hmm.
Paul recognizes we're not walking by sight. We're not just living physical lives where our works are what's important in the world around us. We're living by faith.
Mm.
And when we live by faith, that's when we have confidence to stand before the judgment seat of Christ,
Right.
to receive judgment for what we've done in the body.
That's right.
It's based on the faith.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, basically my explanation that I think essentially brings together that last point and then a little bit of the judgment being a confirmation is that we are judged by our works,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not a judgment to whether or not we get to go to heaven. The judgment is based on your works. Did you have faith?
Exactly.
That's what we're being judged for. The purpose of the judgment is to determine, did you have faith or not?
Right.
And it is the faith that then places us in the family of God,
Mm-hmm.
gives us security of eternity spent with him,
Mm-hmm.
not apart from him.
Right. Exactly.
But the way you tell what you're judged by, how you judge if you have faith, is
Mhm.
works.
Yeah. In a sports realm,
Hmm.
I might say that I am a fan of a particular team.
Hmm.
So we live near Portsmouth. Our football team here is called Pompey, and I might say I'm a Pompey fan. But I never follow the games. I don't know who the manager is. When anybody else ever plays Pompey, I'm always for that team.
Yeah.
I don't own a Pompey shirt or a scarf or anything. There's no evidence that I am actually a Pompey fan, and in fact, my life and my actions obviously say the contrary.
Yeah.
So I can say that I'm a Pompey fan,
Yeah.
but if people would look at me, they would say he's not a Pompey fan.
Yeah.
And but if I really truly am a Pompey fan, I'll have a T-shirt and I'll have a scarf, and
Yeah.
and I will know about the team and I will support the team and I
Yep.
will be against the other team when they're
Yeah.
playing.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
And,
good.
and so I can say I have faith in Jesus,
Yep.
but if there's nothing in my life to actually back that up and prove it,
Yep.
then I'm really just a liar.
Yeah, absolutely. That's good. That's a good analogy. And I think that maybe sometimes in the way we think, if we substitute the word allegiance for the word faith,
Mm-hmm.
it helps the meaning of that analogy just stick.
Right.
Because allegiance is something you can claim,
Mm-hmm.
but you can tell by the way you live
Mm-hmm.
if you actually have allegiance or loyalty
Right.
to somebody or something.
Yep.
Yeah. To take another spin on the analogy, some people think of their walk with Jesus as being the fan of a team,
Mm-hmm.
and the call then is to be a good fan.
Hmm.
You know, kind of like what you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, Jesus is not calling us to be a fan of the team. He's calling us to be a player on the team.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And then even more so, you can claim to be a player on the team, but if you never play in any of the games, or at least not sitting on the bench, if you just don't even go,
Right.
you're not.
Right.
You know, you're just not one.
That's right.
And it means more than just putting on the jersey.
Mm-hmm.
And it means more than just, you know, watching the games from your living room or
Yep.
caring about the team.
Mm-hmm.
You actually have to take action,
Yeah.
you know?
Yep. Yep.
You actually have to do something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know the one of the examples the Bible uses continuously along those lines is not necessarily in sporting events, but in a warfare. So we are called to be part of an army, and we are fighting against the forces of evil. And while you know on a sports team you've only got a few select players, they're the elite, they're the best. In an army, you've got all sorts of people, and it requires all sorts of people,
Yes.
not just the people
Yes.
who are on the front line with the weapons,
Right.
but it's the people in the back who are supporting them, and it's
Yeah.
the people who are doing all of the things to encourage them. And that's where we all, as true believers by faith, can be involved in
Yeah.
the conflict,
Yeah.
and what God has called us to.
And this might be another good opportunity for us to just draw the line one more time in case people are getting confused. We're not saying that you are one day going to be judged by how many goals you scored,
Right.
or how many you stopped, or how many kills you got on the front lines, or how many people you patched up in the medical room, or anything like that.
Right.
It's not about your performance that earns you salvation.
Right.
It's whether or not you got out there and did something. You
Yeah.
know, even if you failed, you know, if you had faith, it means you were willing
Right.
to play or to
Exactly.
fight or to put forth your effort.
Mm-hmm.
Faith determines if you would do that.
Yeah.
And that heart of faith is what God is looking for.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And it's the result of a call. So God calls us to trust me, have faith in me, believe in me, and we say yes. And he says, okay, the result of that faith is that now you will fight on my team.
Yeah.
For me.
Yeah.
And if we say, well, I'm sorry, I'm not doing that.
Right.
Then actually we never had faith.
That's right.
In the first place.
Exactly right. Yep. And I think that there are some Christian denominations, and maybe they wouldn't put it this way, but I believe the result of their theology is a judgment based on works that does not acknowledge what we're saying, but instead is genuinely a level of performance that earns you a place in God's eternity.
Right.
And
right.
that's what we reject and say the Bible speaks directly against that way of understanding.
Yeah.